So anytime we talk about behaviors that people get hooked on or that seem to kind of hijack our intentions, you'll hear people bring up dopamine. And everyone talks about it like dopamine is a little reward chemical or a pleasure chemical. Like we get a squirt of dopamine for doing something good. In other words, people talk as if dopamine is itself the real reinforcer, the SR in our equation. But that's the wrong way to think about dopamine. First off, basically everything we do causes dopamine release. Dopamine is basically part of everything the brain does. Dopamine does not mean reward. And if something produces dopamine, that does not mean it's addictive. When it comes to actual addictions, like physiological addiction to a drug, we know that it changes how the dopamine system functions. Yes, it does change some of the dopamine-related processes, but it's not just something simple like drugs cause dopamine release. We need to get over that popular misconception, just like we need to get over the myth that oxytocin is a love hormone, or that flooding the brain with serotonin is a good way to increase mood. Serotonin may be involved in some processes that are important for mood, but serotonin doesn't equal happy mood. Oxytocin doesn't equal love, and dopamine certainly doesn't equal reward. So here's an excerpt from a nice Guardian article write-up debunking a lot of the dopamine hype. They say here, dopamine is indeed involved in addiction, but it isn't a pleasure chemical. In fact, dopamine has lots of functions in the brain, being involved in everything from regulating movement to the control of attention. In great part, its effects depend on which of the brain's pathways it's operating in. The wonderfully named tuberoinfundibular pathway regulates hormone release, and it's important in stimulating the production of breast milk. This is why an unfortunate side effect of some antipsychotic medication used to treat schizophrenia, which primarily alters the dopamine system, can be lactation, even in men. Now, we don't call dopamine the lactation chemical, so we shouldn't be calling it the reward chemical either. If you really want to understand how addiction and dopamine interact, you might look up opponent process theory for addiction. There are some really good explainers online, but also in the peer-reviewed literature, like this 2008 article that I've cited here from Koob and Lamal. They talk about the neurobiology of like drug abuse and addiction. But at any rate, the dopamine system, you just need to understand, it's not a reward system. At most, the system people are usually referring to when they talk about a dopamine system could better be described as a reward expectation system, or maybe a reward prediction system, or a system for learning about contingencies that might lead to reward. In other words, a system for learning. SD sets the occasion for a behavior leading to a reinforcer. We know this because we actually find just as much activity in dopamine, often much more dopamine, when, say, a gambler almost wins compared to when they actually do win. So getting that near win is actually more of a dopamine surge than winning. The dopamine system goes wild for not getting a reward, more so than for getting the reward. And why? Because when you almost win, there's some uncertainty there, right? That means there's important information for that predictive machine of your brain to incorporate into its predictive models to help gain new information about the world. The dopamine system that people are usually referring to, it's a learning system to help us spot patterns, not a reward system to make us feel good as a reward for our behaviors. So indeed, stop thinking of dopamine as the reinforcer at the end of our equation. Instead, we get a dopamine burst when a discriminative stimulus shows up, when a SD is present that tells us we're in the type of situation where my brain knows or suspects I can do some behavior to get rewarded. So really, dopamine plays a part in a behavior control system. It's not the reward, but the cue that tells us we're in a situation, the SD, where we can do something to get a reward. And indeed, experiments show that if you block dopamine, what happens? You end up blocking the behavior rather than that rewarding feeling after the behavior. In other words, if you block dopamine, it's not the reward that doesn't come at the end of the equation up there, it's that we don't even do the R in the equation. Dopamine is doing something to change our behavior earlier in that equation, earlier in that process. I actually think neurobiology professor Robert Sapolsky, he's from Stanford, he explains this stuff really well. So I want to show you just a short clip from one of his great talks. This guy is one of my academic crushes, by the way. He's got so much interesting work out there, including the 2017 book Behave and a lot of great YouTube videos. So anyway, here's what he has to say about dopamine.
For a TV, the world is thinking.
This monkey has been trained that when the little light comes on, it's one of those sessions where I can now get food, and it knows that if I press this lever 10 times, after a little bit of a delay, I'll get some food. If I press the lever 10 more times, I'll get some more food. It understands the task. So what do we have here? We have first a signal, the light coming on, saying it's one of those sessions. We're starting one of those. Then the monkey does the work, and then with a delay, it gets the reward. And what everyone initially thought was dopamine would go up after the reward. That's not when it goes up. It goes up when the signal comes on. What's this? This is the monkey there sitting and saying, I know this. I know the drill. I know this. I'm on top of this. This is going to be great. I know what I do now. This is completely perfect. 100% I'm going for today. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It's about the anticipation of pleasure. It's about the pursuit of happiness rather than happiness itself. And what's most remarkable is experimentally, if you block that rise of dopamine from occurring, you don't get the work. You don't get the behavior. This is not only the anticipation, but this is what is capable of eliciting goal-directed behavior. Amazing elaboration on this, which now begins to tell us something real familiar. Okay, so in this study, elaboration, rather than this design, you press the lever the right number of times, you get reward. Do the work, you get a reward 100% of the time. That's how it works. Now instead shift to where you get the reward only 50% of the time. You do the work, and only about half the time you get the reward. So what happens to dopamine levels there? This is what they do. They go through the roof. Because what have you just done? You've introduced the word maybe into the equation. And maybe is addictive like nothing else out there. Because the light comes on, and you're doing the, I know how this works, this is going to be great, but I screwed up last time because I didn't get the food, but this time I'm feeling good today, but I'm a total screw up, and I'm inadequate in junior high school, and it was terrible, but maybe this time this is my lucky day, and just vacillating all over the place. What we see here is dopamine comes pouring out like mad. It's the uncertainty of the reward. And here's the really elegant thing they did in that study. Now, instead of a 50% reward rate, either a 25% or 75%. These are diametrically opposite states. Worse news, better news, the only thing they have in common is you've decreased the level of unpredictability, and the rise in dopamine winds up being halfway between the 50% and the 100. And what's this about? This is the world of brilliant social engineering by humans, say, in Las Vegas, who understand how to design a place to take a curve where somebody has a gazillionth of 1% chance of getting a reward and making you think because it's this special day in this casino, and you especially are so much tilted to the right that you are going to get, and humans are profoundly manipulable in this realm. And it turns out so are other species, the exact same neurochemistry. So what winds up being unique about us? And what you see is, with humans, it's the time dimension. You get the signal, you do the work, you get the reward. And the question becomes, how much time, lag time, can there be between the work and the reward to still elicit the behavior, to still get the work coming out? And we have just entered uniquely human terrain there for the very simple reason that probably most of us recognize, which is somewhere along the way, almost all of us worked very hard in school to get good SAT scores, to get into a good college, to get GREs, to get into a good grad school, to get a good job, to get in the nursing home of our choice there, sort of thing. And what we see is this astonishing ability of humans to keep those dopamine levels up for decades and decades waiting for the reward. And in the most bizarre, unique realm of this in humans, sometimes we could maintain it with a belief system where the reward doesn't come in our lifetime. The reward comes after our death. The reward comes in our afterlife. The reward comes unto the next generations. And there's no monkey out there who's willing to lever press all the time because of what St. Peter's going to think somewhere down the line. So that is unique about us.
So that came from a longer talk that he gave about humans compared to other animals. He's actually got tons of great talks online if you Google the name Sapolsky. But yeah, there's tons of research into dopamine, and we understand it well enough now to move beyond this simplistic idea that we get a squirt of dopamine as some sort of pleasure chemical reward when we do certain behaviors. Anyway, I just wanted to ensure we were clear about that. When we're talking about the kinds of behaviors that some people might call addiction-like the way some of us interact with our phones or social media or whatever. Now, speaking of phones, I wanted to briefly mention a couple additional kind of side effects of the technology from a psychology angle, though keep in mind, we get lots of amazing benefits from this technology too. So don't get caught up in binary thinking like technology A is good or technology B is evil, just because here we happen to be focusing on a few of the more subtle problems with technology today, right? We can improve the technology or how we interact with it without saying we need to throw it all out the window. So, as you no doubt already know, texting and driving is very dangerous. For the love of the 3-year-old whose head you smash open, whose family you leave devastated, just don't text while you're driving. Please wait. But even talking on the phone can be somewhat dangerous, which initially led to laws requiring phone calls to be hands-free, like using Bluetooth in your car. Except we now know from psychology research that hands-free phone calls are just as dangerous as holding the phone to your ear. Because the issue is about the attentional capacity of the brain, not what your hand is doing. But all this may be familiar to you. And maybe you're one of the people who's responsible and you keep your phone in your pocket or in your cup holder while you drive and you don't look at it. That's great. But do you still leave your sound notifications on? Does a ding come in when you get a text, even though you're not looking at it? Turns out some research has shown that merely hearing a notification sound, even if you don't check the phone, even if you don't pull the phone out and look at it, just hearing that notification, knowing there's something waiting for you, can actually distract drivers and increase their chance of an accident. It's like an extra little item stored in working memory until you get home and check your phone. It's a mental reminder I need to check it when I arrive or when I hit a stoplight. So you're more distracted for the drive, even without pulling your phone out, just hearing it as a sort of discriminative stimulus. So safety-wise, the best advice would be put your phone on silent and out of sight so you don't see notification displays or lights or anything like that, in addition to not hearing the notification sounds. Otherwise, that behavioral pull of those discriminative stimuli can be pretty strong, and even if you don't reach out and grab your phone, your other behaviors have been affected by that SD. There are ways, by the way, to automatically set a phone to do not disturb when you're driving, so you might consider that if you're otherwise kind of too tempted sometimes. Now, that said, our phone use behavior can have more mundane side effects, like in the case of phubbing, which is a combination of phone plus snubbing, like snubbing someone, not paying attention to them. Basically, in social situations, it can sometimes be hard to go for very long without checking your phone, like even just glancing at it for a second, right? But when you do, you may get caught by a couple notifications and suddenly 30 seconds or longer has gone by and you weren't really processing the conversation. Your friends were there talking and you were kind of just absorbed in your phone, right? It's happened to all of us. Or you're on a first date and the person pulls out their phone, maybe because a little notification made their screen light up even though they had it on silent. Now you're sitting there watching your date look at their phone instead of talking. Or even if the phone doesn't have an SD triggering their behavior, we've seen that your own internal states can. So is there a little lull in the conversation? That's normal, right? Or maybe you're just bored for a second. Your habit may be to pick up your phone, even though a couple seconds of awkward silence is a standard part of a first date. Or maybe you're having FOMO, fear of missing out, and in the moment you decide to check if your other Tinder match wrote you back. Regardless, this behavior of looking at your phone during a social situation, it's been called phubbing, and there's a fair bit of research on it. So for example, we know it leads to more relationship conflict, and there's evidence suggesting it may indirectly impact things like depression through effects on other variables like relationship satisfaction and life satisfaction. Also, it can lead to some behavioral loops between two people in a social context. So Imagine you're sitting on the couch with your significant other watching TV together. That's a shared experience where you're mutually attending to the same thing, right? You're sharing attention in the same direction. But then you notice that they've picked up their phone and they're just kind of mindlessly browsing on their phone. You might feel a little less connected in that moment, right? So what do? Maybe you turn to your own phone, especially since doing that behavior temporarily escapes the internal feeling you just had of being phubbed, which means the next time it happens, you're even more likely to turn to your own phone, right? Negative reinforcement. But then you might end up having that same effect on your partner, and so on until you're both in the habit of sitting silently next to each other on your separate phones, interacting less than you might really like to. So our behaviors with our phones can potentially cause some social issues if we're not mindful of how we interact with them or how our behaviors have been kind of conditioned into habits. By the way, studies have shown that the mere presence of a phone shapes our dyadic or two-way interactions with negative effects on closeness, on connection, and on conversation quality. So like the presence of a phone just sitting on the table leads to people rating the conversations they had as inferior and to lower levels of empathic concern during those conversations. And this happens even if you never look at or use the phone. Like literally just its mere presence is enough to have those effects, to lower your social connection to someone else. So if you want to have a closer connection with your date or the friend you're catching up with over coffee or your kid that you're playing with at the table, you can get immediate gains in connection and in conversation quality simply by keeping your phone on silent in your pocket or your purse. Keep it out of sight as well as quiet. Now, while we're talking about the social side of our tech-related behaviors, I wanted to bring up another social behavioral element that's often manipulated by social media companies today. Initially, unintentionally, but now very much intentionally. So there's this idea originally from behavioral ecology. It's called social reciprocity. Basically, like many group living species, we evolved to reciprocate. What's sometimes called tit for tat in evolutionary biology or game theory. Like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. One chimp groomed a second chimp on Monday, so the second chimp is more likely to groom the first chimp on Tuesday. You shared food with me last time, I'll share food with you this time. You helped me out here, I'll help you out next week. You help me move, I'll help you move. It promotes group cohesion, so the trait has evolved in quite a few social species. So how does social media hijack this, whether it's by accident or design? Well, think of it this way. You liked my photo. Now I kind of feel like I should like one of your photos, right? Or you sent me an email. I feel responsible. Like I should really write you back at some point. Or you followed me, so I guess I'll follow you back, right? So how do social media companies deliberately exploit this stuff in their designs now that they've come to understand these processes? Well, companies like Facebook, they automate the process of inviting or friending someone or of tagging a photo. So like, oh, our algorithm tagged a face for you or whatever. They make these things very low effort, right? They automate it as much as possible. That means when we as the recipient, right, on the other end of this social interaction, when we get that automated machine generated notification that Natalie invited me to join LinkedIn, our brain treats it as if the person, Natalie herself, made a conscious, deliberate act to choose me to invite, even though it was actually the website that sent out a massive pile of invites indiscriminately to the person's whole address book. But it feels like the person initiated a social interaction. And we are evolved, social reciprocity, right? We feel an obligation to reciprocate, which in the long run means we're more likely to use that app or that site or to use it more often. Or another example, like Facebook doesn't let you turn off read receipts on messages. Why? Well, now that you know I sent you a message, or now that you know, that I saw your message, right? Read receipts means the other person knows, oh, you've read it, right? So now that you know I saw your message, I'm going to feel even more obligation to respond rather than taking control of my own time or behavior, right? I now feel that obligation, so that has manipulated my behavior. I'm more likely to do something that I might not have done otherwise. So they've designed things so that social reciprocity causes us to behave in ways that, in the long run, overall aggregate across people, benefit the company. So now you might be thinking like, okay, I'm doing something else right now, cool. Not for long though, because when we take together sort of the power of all these little nudges and all these little kind of dark design tricks, notifications plus social reciprocity effects plus intermittent reinforcement effects plus enhanced motivation plus ease of use, all these little things they do, no wonder our behavior gets hijacked by these processes that are designed by some very clever companies. And effects like social reciprocity are pretty strong. In one study, they found that 70% of office emails are read within 6 seconds of arriving. And studies show people feel a lot of guilt over unanswered emails because of social reciprocity. Now, I could go on and on about this stuff because entire fields of study are dedicated to manipulating our behaviors through these design choices, these dark patterns, these learning and conditioning principles. But I'll leave it to you to actually try and think through further ways in which things like online games or social media or even clickbait news or other heavily designed technology may be affecting our behaviors through the conditioning processes that we've learned about. So I will note that design these days is often done not step by step by humans making choices at these companies, but sometimes now through algorithms and a lot of automated user testing. So Facebook, Google, these huge behemoth companies, they have monetary incentives. In some cases, they're legally required for a lot of companies because of shareholders. They have monetary incentives to design interfaces and algorithms to measure and then manipulate certain behaviors, what they call engagement, without necessarily taking into account whether those behaviors are healthy for the users. That's how we end up with heavily emotional content that shows up more and more on our news feeds or in the stories we read online. And that maximally polarizing content, it shows up a lot more because they've learned that getting people to feel righteously angry is a great way to maximize engagement, maximize interaction on their platform to keep your eyeballs there to look at more ads. And these are companies that have a reach of literally billions of customers. A sizable chunk of the entire Earth worth of humans being influenced by a single company. And they're making choices that affect that many people every minute of every day. So think of it this way. If Facebook gets 2.7 billion users to waste just half an hour a day on something they otherwise wouldn't, just half an hour a day, but multiplied across 2.7 billion people, that means every single day there is 154,000 human years of time down the drain. 150,000 years of combined human time wasted every day, day after day after day, just from that half hour aggregated across those people. That's a lot. 150,000 years ago, our ancestors were crafting stone tools in the Stone Age. So this stuff adds up given the scale of these companies and their reach. And of course, their tricks to change behavior by maximizing engagement may also have massive political consequences. Look up Facebook's role in the incredible violence and murder and rape that happened to the Rohingya people in Myanmar in late 2010s. Like, there's a lot that happens as a side effect of this stuff. And again, we don't think our behavior is being controlled, but neither does the rat or the pigeon in the box, right? But decades and decades of psychology research shows that we are generally just not aware of the influences on our behavior. For example, lots of social psychology studies show that we often insert a narrative to make sense of our choices after we make the choices. In other words, we make up an explanation for our behavior after we've done the behavior for other reasons. And then our brain believes that we chose to do that behavior for the made up reason. And this confabulation, it all happens unconsciously and automatically. And we can prove it. We can show it in the lab. Like in the lab, we can manipulate people into making a certain choice without them realizing that we dictated their choice. Yet when you ask them why they chose what they did, they'll tell you a believable story about why that was their choice. And they do believe that story. We do. We all do that. We aren't aware of the influences on our behavior and why we do what we do, but we pretend to know after the fact. Our brain is wired to think we know why we did what we did, but it's making up those stories afterward. Now, lest this all come off as sounding hopeless and pessimistic, I wanted to finish with a few tips for kind of minimizing some of the influence and control these technologies have over us so that we can more mindfully use the tech in ways that benefit us, or at least make more conscious kind of trade-offs, right? And know what we're getting into. So let's talk a little about defense against the dark arts. So Google's former design ethicist, he's named Tristan Harris. He's also behind the 2020 documentary, The Social Dilemma, which is pretty good. He's written quite a lot about this, starting heavily around like 2015, 2016. And he has some good talks online where he's provided some really helpful recommendations. I've actually taken a lot of examples from his great work, but I'll just give you a few and you can look up more. So first, One tip, given the ways that designers utilize color to control and automate our behavior, to kind of pull our finger towards a certain app before we've even consciously decided what app we intend to open, you can actually undo some of the strength of that conditioning by switching your phone to grayscale. This is an option in pretty much all phone models now. Like in an iPhone, you can use the accessibility settings to make an accessibility shortcut so that a simple click or tapping it a couple times can turn on or off the grayscale. So you can still turn color on really quickly and easily when you want to look at a friend's photo or something else, but leave it off the rest of the time when you're trying to stay productive or trying to resist the temptation of, a game you're a little too hooked on. Another tip that works well comes from proximity variables. So like, put the temptation out of reach. Are you trying to study or read or do something else right now? It's way, way too easy to interrupt yourself, especially when you get a little bored or a little overwhelmed or stressed, right? It's way too easy to just grab the phone if the phone is right there within reach. But those distractions are actually much less likely if you have to get up and even go to another room to check your phone. This is literally a self-control issue, like we talked about the smaller, sooner rewards versus larger, later rewards. And it's a way of manipulating those curves to make the self-control behavior more probable. This is actually just a form of commitment response, like we talked about. I'm doing something at the start, early on, putting my phone out of reach, that'll make self-control behaviors much more likely later on when I'm tempted due to my boredom or anxiety or stress, or when that smaller, sooner reward is right there in the moment at its maximum value, right? And if you need to have your phone nearby for some reason, like if it's important for your work or you're waiting for a crucial phone call, then turn off non-essential notifications. This can actually be really helpful in general. Like, just invest 5 minutes now to go through your notifications and really think about which ones are doing you a service versus where maybe you want some more control back in your life. Experiment with fewer notifications and see if it makes things better or worse. And be careful not to just turn off one form of notification like sound, but then leave the phone in sight while you work, where you'll see the screen flash for every incoming notification, because then it's just going to distract you and pull you as another SD, another discriminative stimulus. Just like we discussed with someone who hears their phone ding while driving, right? And becomes more likely to get in a wreck even without checking it. So if you're going to turn off those notifications, try and turn them off as much as you can. If you're charging your phone, maybe you set your place your charger instead of being at your desk or at your bed. Put your charger somewhere across the room where you have to actually go to it if you really decide you want to use your phone right now, rather than having those automated habits hijack your behavior unconsciously. By the way, the psychologist Tom Stafford, he's written a lot on this stuff on his Mind Hacks blog, which is a really good blog if you ever want to read it. It's got like decades of work going back. We know from behavior analysis literature that timing is another important kind of variable to think about if you're looking to replace unhealthy smartphone behaviors with other behaviors. So think of it this way. Phone rewards are very fast. They're kind of immediate, right? They're the smaller, sooner rewards of the Ainsley-Racklin model we talked about. If there's no delay, that means they're at their maximum reinforcement potential compared to those larger, later rewards that are far off. So trying to replace smartphone use with healthy behaviors requires using what we know about effective reinforcement timing, as well as what we know about choice and delay discounting, and all that stuff we learned about from the basic psychology literature. So we can use those tricks from the self-control literature to change our behavioral choices around where we spend our time and how we use our technology. Also, you can try and build in your own exit points, your own version of pagination, like we talked about before. Like, set a timer before you open social media or respond to a notification. So when you're about to go onto Facebook or about to go onto Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, set a timer. Choose the amount of time that you are choosing consciously to spend on that activity right now. Like, I'm going to set aside 15 minutes right now to check social media stuff. Ironically, there are apps for that. There are apps you can use technology for good, right? To help you get more control over your technology use. But then when that timer is up, you have something pinging you that kind of pulls you out of that state and makes you aware of how long you've spent absorbed in that scrolling or playing. Because time can go by pretty fast when you're just scrolling down an infinite scroll. So you can always, in that moment, decide, well, I still want to keep doing this. I'm going to set the timer for later and keep on scrolling, sure. But now you're aware. You know how much time has gone by and how much you're committing to for the next chunk, and you're making that choice consciously. For that matter, kind of along the same lines, but more broadly, practicing mindfulness behaviors can be one way to help interrupt a lot of the automated habits and kind of keep us more aware of what we're doing at any given time, thus providing way more exit points to change our trajectory. You can even train mindfulness behaviors by using an app. There are some mindfulness apps that will play a bell sound at random times just to remind you to stop, become aware of where your thoughts are and what your behaviors are right now, and to practice some mindfulness. And so that bell over and over again will help you practice catching yourself and being mindful. Oh yeah, I was trapped in social media again. It's been 40 minutes. The more you do it, the easier it becomes, and you gain more power and you gain more ability to exit those habitual and automated behaviors. Or if that's not your jam, then stick with more external control techniques. Try out programs that restrict how long you can spend on certain apps, or even block certain sites from loading at all on your device. What you do is you institute these controls when you're feeling strong, right? When you're planning ahead of time, so that future you doesn't have to make that hard self-control decision at the time when it's hardest. In the moment when you're overwhelmed and that smaller, sooner reward of an escape behavior is right there waiting to negatively reinforce itself. Anyway, I will stop there for this video so the video doesn't get too long. But having gone through this course, you yourself could probably come up with some great and creative ways to change your behavior around technology to better suit your own needs if you just pick out any of the terms or concepts we've learned about and think about how they apply to your behaviors with technology. Just to take a random example, we learned about operant reinstatement at one point, right? You might think, how does that apply here? Okay, so what's operant reinstatement? That was where an unwanted behavior might go through extinction, right? It might be totally extinguished, where it's not happening anymore. But then the mere non-contingent exposure to the old reinforcer can start the extinguished behavior back up again. That's reinstatement. So how might that apply to smartphone use? Well, I don't know, imagine an ex-girlfriend who keeps texting you and it's really out of control and uncomfortable. So you start ignoring your ex, right? You're ignoring her texting behavior instead of responding to it. So you're putting her behavior on extinction, right? She no longer gets the reinforcement of your replies. She's not getting that attention as a reward. Her behavior will probably go down. First, she'll do the usual extinction burst. You may get a bunch of texts from her as soon as you stop reinforcing and start doing the extinction. But eventually, if you keep ignoring, if you're consistent, then her behavior will taper off and disappear, right? She'll eventually stop texting you. But what if you accidentally send her a text one day when you meant to send it to an old friend with the same name? Oops, that mere exposure to the old reinforcer, totally non-contingent for many of her recent behaviors, but that mere exposure will cause reinstatement. Her behavior will start back up again, and now she's texting you once more. You've provided a cue, a reminder, a trigger of the past when her texting behavior was reinforced with returned attention. So the behavior returns despite all the extinction that you did. That's just one example, right? For a random term from our course, reinstatement. But you could do the same thing with anything we learned. And instead of technology using behaviors, you could apply it to parenting behaviors or relationship behaviors or purchasing behaviors or eating behaviors or literally anything else you do in your life. That's why these principles of learning and conditioning that we've been talking about are so powerful. They describe the way our brain is built as this general purpose machine for adapting and changing its own rules based on our past history of reinforcement, based on the experiences we've had interacting with our environment from the moment we're born. Learning and conditioning are a huge part of everything we do.